History remembers one as a seductress who tore a kingdom apart, and the other as a fool who gave it all away for nothing. Anne and Mary Boleyn were sisters, rivals, and pawns in the most dangerous game of love ever played. For 500 years, we have labelled Anne a witch and Mary a whore, but the truth is far more complex and terrifying. They were two women trapped in the orbit of a king who consumed people like wine, living in a court where a single wrong look could cost you your head. Their story isn't just a royal soap opera. It's a brutal lesson in survival, where the only way to win was to navigate the deadly whims of a tyrant who held the power of life and death in his hands. While Anne is the icon who changed history, Mary is the ghost who haunts the margins. But look closer, and you realize that Mary might have been the smart one. She was the first to catch Henry VIII's eye, the first to share his bed, and arguably the only one to escape him with her life. Anne, the brilliant strategist, aimed for the crown and paid for it with her blood. It begs the question, is it better to burn bright and die young, or to fade into the shadows and live to tell the tale? To understand their tragic end, we have to go back to the beginning, to a time before the scandals, when they were just two girls sent to the most sophisticated court in Europe to learn the art of being a woman. The Boleyn girls were shipped off to France, the finishing school for the elite, but they learned very different lessons. Anne thrived in the intellectual atmosphere, absorbing the politics, the fashion, and the dangerous idea that a woman could have a voice. She returned to England not as a submissive girl, but as a charismatic force of nature. Mary, on the other hand, learned the more traditional path, submission. She became the mistress of the French king first, gaining a reputation that would follow her home like a shadow, branding her as easy prey for powerful men. When they returned to the English court, the stage was set for a twisted love triangle. Mary caught Henry VIII's eye first. She became his mistress, possibly bore him children, and was essentially used and discarded. She was the appetizer before the main course. It was a humiliation that Anne watched closely. Anne saw her sister's shame and made a vow that would change the world. She would never be a mistress. She would be a queen or nothing at all. This decision sparked the king's obsession. Henry was used to women who said yes. Anne's no drove him to the brink of madness, starting a 7-year courtship that would shatter the church and rewrite the laws of God. Anne played a dangerous game of hard to get, retreating to Hever Castle and forcing the king to chase her. It wasn't just about chastity, it was political brilliance. She demanded marriage, a demand that required Henry to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and break with the Pope. For years, the world waited while Henry tore his kingdom apart to put a ring on Anne's finger. She wasn't just a lover, she was a revolution in a French hood, a woman who forced a king to choose between his faith and his desire. Finally, in 1533, she won. She was crowned queen, pregnant with the heir Henry so desperately wanted. It was the peak of her power, the moment she had risked everything for. But in the Tudor court, victory is just a prelude to danger. The higher you climb, the further you have to fall, and Anne was standing on a precipice made of enemies who were just waiting for her to slip. The fall began almost immediately. The child she bore wasn't the promised son. It was a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry's disappointment was palpable, and the clock started ticking on Anne's life. While Anne fought for her life in the snake pit of the court, Mary made a shocking move. Widowed and ignored, she did the unthinkable. She married for love. She chose a soldier with no rank and no fortune, a man named William Stafford. It was a slap in the face to her ambitious family. Anne and her father were furious. Mary had thrown away her position for a nobody, proving once again that she didn't understand the game of power. They banished her, and the Queen cut off her own sister, leaving her destitute. It seemed like the final victory of the smart sister over the foolish one. But fate has a twisted sense of irony. By banishing Mary, Anne inadvertently saved her life. While Mary went off to live in obscurity, Anne was left alone at court, isolated and vulnerable, just as the king's eye began to wander to a new, quieter woman named Jane Seymour. Anne's failure to produce a male heir became her death warrant. A miscarriage in 1536 sealed her fate. Henry decided she was cursed, and his right-hand man, Thomas Cromwell, concocted a monstrous lie to get rid of her. Cromwell's plot was swift and brutal. He accused Anne of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George. It was a smear campaign designed to destroy not just her life, but her soul. The charges of incest and treason were absurd, but in a tyranny. Truth is irrelevant. Anne was arrested and dragged to the Tower of London, the very place she had stayed before her coronation. Realizing too late that her ambition had built her own scaffold, the trial was a show, a piece of theatre where the verdict was written before the jury sat down. Anne defended herself with wit and courage. But she was arguing with ghosts. The king wanted her gone. She watched her friends and her brother die, knowing she was next. A queen sacrificed on the altar of a king's ego. On May 19, 1536, Anne walked out to Tower Green. She didn't scream or beg. She faced the French swordsman with a dignity that shamed her accusers. The execution was precise. One stroke of the sword, and the woman who had changed England was gone. Henry erased her from his life, marrying Jane Seymour just days later. He thought he had destroyed Anne Boleyn. He believed that by cutting off her head, he had silenced her forever, turning her into nothing more than a cautionary tale. But while Anne died, Mary survived. She lived out her days in the countryside with the man she loved. Far away from the axe and the intrigue, she died a wealthy woman, inheriting the Boleyn estate after her father's death. The foolish sister won the only prize that really mattered, a long life and a peaceful death in her own bed. And Anne, she got the last laugh. Her daughter, Elizabeth, became the greatest monarch in English history. Elizabeth I ruled for 45 years. The golden age of England. She was Anne's revenge, the living proof that Henry was wrong. The Boleyn legacy wasn't the son Henry wanted. It was the daughter he rejected. Anne's blood didn't stain the Tudor line. It defined it, proving that a woman's worth isn't determined by a man's approval. The story of the Boleyn sisters is a tragedy of 2 paths. One chose power and paid the ultimate price. The other chose love and survived. They remind us that history is written by the survivors, but it is shaped by the martyrs, whether you choose the crown or the quiet life. The system is rigged against you. But sometimes, just sometimes, you can beat the house. If you found this deep dive into the Boleyn sisters fascinating, hit that subscribe button. We have more dark history secrets waiting for you. Which sister do you think truly won? Let us know in the comments. See you next time.
her portraits destroyed, her tomb left unmarked. For centuries, historians dismissed her as a rumor meant to scare servants into obedience. But recently surfaced letters hint at something uglier. A queen whose love curdled into obsession, whose secrets could have snapped the Tudor throne in half. This is not the tale of the wives you already know. This is the one history buried, and for a reason. Stay until the end, because her story does not end with her death. It begins there. And before you decide this is just a ghost story, ask yourself one question. Why would a court that documented every feast, every birth, every insult, leave a hole shaped like a queen? The palace did not welcome her. It loomed like a maze of gold and gloom, heavy with the breath of centuries. Corridors seemed to listen. Portraits of queens smiled too sweetly, their painted eyes dimmed by candle smoke, as if even art learned to lie for survival. From her carriage she saw London's torches flicker in fog like dying stars. People cheered her name that night, though most had no idea who she truly was. They had watched too many brides pass through those gates to believe any would last. Inside, beeswax sweetness mixed with the rot of old secrets. Courtiers bowed low, smiles polished, eyes weighing her worth. Henry watched from the dais, wrapped in crimson, gaze steady, hungry, calculating. And in that moment the court pretended this was joy. Not a sentence with ribbons tied around it. She curtsied, gown whispering across stone like a soft warning. The orchestra resumed, and for a heartbeat the court acted human again. Yet behind every toast and jeweled compliment, danger stirred. Henry's moods were a kingdom of their own, shifting without warning, crushing people the way tides crush sandcastles. That night, in her new chamber, she stared out at snow gathering on the parapets. The city slept, unaware of the quiet storm now sealed behind palace walls. Her maid lit a single candle, and in the mirror she caught herself, young, serene, unprepared. But beneath that calm, something moved. A flicker of instinct that told her beauty was no shield and affection was not protection. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed softly. Footsteps faded. She turned, half expecting someone to be standing there. The room was empty. Only the tapestry shifted, stirred by a draft that felt too much like breath. She steadied the candle, but the flame bent toward her as if pulled by a presence. In that small, trembling light, she understood something most brides learn too late. The palace was alive. It watched. It remembered. It devoured. And before sleep took her, she whispered words no clerk would ever record. Let them forget me. Before the palace walls swallowed her name, she came from a quieter world, where meadows bled into mist and the air smelled faintly of iron and lilies. Her father held a modest title and an immense ambition, the kind of man who smiled at opportunity but rarely at his children. Her mother taught her the art of silence, the kind that opens doors when words cannot. And while other girls practiced embroidery, she studied faces, the hesitation in a glance, the false warmth in a smile. She learned early that charm is currency, and innocence can be forged like steel. When Henry's envoys arrived, her household erupted as if heaven itself had knocked. Silver was polished that had long forgotten its shine. Prayers were offered with shaking hands. Letters flew like panicked birds. She watched it all with stillness that unsettled even the servants. She knew the summons meant she could never return unchanged. Her first meeting with the king was not a poet's fantasy. No thunderstruck silence. No angels singing. Just two people who recognized something familiar in one another. The hunger for significance. Henry spoke gently. Words measured. Smile rehearsed. She answered with poise, neither flattered nor afraid. That composure hooked him. She was the calm after his tempests, the mirror that reflected his grandeur without question. Rumor spread quickly, as it always did. Some said she bewitched him with one glance. Others whispered she reminded him of someone he had lost, but to her, love was a story for poets. She sought survival. If affection came, it would be a luxury. Safety was the real dream. And dreams were the first thing the palace loved to steal. The wedding unfolded like a vision painted on glass. Brilliant, fragile, destined to crack. Abbey bells tolled until the air itself vibrated. London overflowed with bodies cheering for love. Though everyone knew this ceremony was not about devotion, it was about control. She arrived veiled in white, so fine it shimmered like frost. Incense hung heavy, mingling with candle smoke. The vows, the ring, the gaze that met hers like a brand pressed to skin. Henry's hand on hers felt not like warmth, but weight. For the spectators, it was perfection. A king redeemed. A bride radiant, but she noticed faces turned away. Lips tightening, eyes refusing to meet hers. Not ghosts, not specters, but living memories of women who had stood there before her. That night, music played until fingers trembled. Cups overflowed. Dancers twirled beneath chandeliers, dripping wax like slow tears. Alone later, she removed her crown and felt its impression still pressed into her skin. In the mirror, she saw not a bride, but a stranger with a smile too practiced. She whispered to her reflection, "The play begins." The first weeks of queenship blurred into ceremony and calculation. Each day brought another audience, another performance. Laughter rippled across banquet tables, but beneath the glitter, unease simmered. Conversations halted when she entered, then resumed half a beat too late. She began to read the court's silent code. Henry's affection came in bursts, extravagant gifts, sudden tenderness, then long absences filled with unexplained silences. Once she believed she could steady him, now she understood no one truly could. At a feast, a foreign ambassador toasted her beauty. Henry smiled too widely. The hall went quiet. She met the king's gaze and felt something chilling in it, almost pitying. Later, she lingered in the candlelit hall, running her fingers along the table's edge. Power, she thought, always left scars, even on wood. A lady in waiting appeared pale and hesitant and whispered, "Be careful of those who smile too much. If you watch and ask." The queen gave a small nod. "I already am." That week, a letter went missing. A servant was dismissed without cause. A door closed when she approached. At night, faint music drifted from chambers where she was not invited. Someone wanted her to feel watched, and someone wanted her to break. She began sleeping with the curtains drawn, as if fabric could stop eyes. One morning, she found a wilted rose placed on her pillow. No note, no explanation. Petals nearly black, stem wet as if freshly cut. She burned it before dawn, but the smell of it stayed, sweet and rotten at the same time. The palace had turned into a masquerade. The laughter at supper no longer sounded like mirth. It sounded like people practicing joy while holding their breath. And when Henry's hand brushed hers at the table, she felt no love, only warning. Morning light slid across her floor in thin streaks like knife edges. Servants moved quietly, careful not to disturb her, polishing mirrors she no longer trusted. Even her reflection looked hollow behind the eyes. The crown had not merely adorned her, it had altered her. She learned quickly that a queen is not a woman. A queen is a symbol wearing a heartbeat. Every word carried consequences. Every silence bred suspicion. somewhere between duty and devotion. Something in her began to fracture, and in that fracture, something colder began to grow. Henry visited when it suited him, leaving behind empty compliments and colder nights. In his absence, she wandered galleries lined with portraits of his past loves. Pale, perfect, haunted. The painters captured beauty, but never dared paint fear.
On the 7th of September, 1533, in the lavish rooms of Greenwich Palace, a cry rang out that would change the course of history. But at that moment, the king didn't hear a triumph, he heard a disappointment. Henry VIII had torn England away from the Catholic Church and discarded his first wife, all for the promise of a son. What he received instead was Elizabeth, the daughter of the infamous Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth arrived into a world that didn't yet know how to value her. To the public, she was a symbol of her mother's witchcraft to her father. She was a reminder of a failed prophecy. But Elizabeth was a survivor from her first breath. She was born into the center of a storm that would eventually claim her mother's life and leave Elizabeth a pawn in a very dangerous game. This is where the legend of the Virgin Queen truly begins, not with power, but with the precariousness of a girl whose existence was a scandal in itself. The first true trauma of Elizabeth's life arrived when she was just 2 years old. In a world of shifting political alliances and a king's volatile heart, her mother, Anne Boleyn, was arrested and executed for adultery. Imagine the confusion of a toddler suddenly stripped of a mother and a title, labeled a bastard by the very man who had once worshipped her mother. Elizabeth was pushed to the periphery of the court, but she was not entirely forgotten. Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, became the stabilizing force the young girl so desperately needed. Catherine was a woman of intellect and grace, and she ensured that Elizabeth received an education that rivaled any prince in Europe. Under Parr's guidance, Elizabeth became highly educated, learning to speak several languages fluently, a weapon of intellect she would later use to outmaneuver the most powerful men in the world. She was being groomed for a throne she wasn't supposed to inherit. When Henry VIII finally died in 1547, the crown passed to Elizabeth's young half-brother, Edward VI. At just 9 years old, Edward became the boy king, and Elizabeth moved into the household of the widowed Catherine Parr. It was a time of relative peace, but in the Tudor world, peace is always a fragile illusion. As Elizabeth watched her brother rule, she saw the pressures of a divided England. Edward was a staunch Protestant, and his reign pushed the country further away from the old faith. But Edward's health was as fragile as his youth. In 1553, at just 15, the boy king died, leaving a power vacuum that would ignite a sisterly rivalry, the likes of which England had never seen. Suddenly, the bastard girl of Greenwich was no longer a side note. She was a threat to the next person in line. With Edward's death, the crown passed to Elizabeth's older half-sister, Mary. Mary was a woman fueled by a different kind of fire. A devout Catholic, she was determined to return England to the Roman faith at any cost. For Mary, Elizabeth was more than just a sibling. She was a Protestant rival and a symbol of their father's betrayal of Mary's own mother, Catherine of Aragon. The tension between the sisters was lethal. Because Elizabeth was Protestant, Mary viewed her with deep suspicion. When a rebellion broke out, Mary seized the opportunity to neutralize the threat. Elizabeth was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, the very place where her mother had spent her final days before the axe fell. Elizabeth walked through those gates, not knowing if she would ever walk out, proving that in the game of crowns, blood is rarely thicker than belief. For months, Elizabeth lived in the shadow of the executioner's block, watching from her windows in the Tower as Mary's reign became synonymous with the fires of persecution. But fortune is a fickle mistress. In 1558, Mary died from illness, and the impossible happened. Elizabeth, the girl who had been declared illegitimate and imprisoned as a traitor, was now the successor to the throne. At the age of 25, Elizabeth I became the Queen of England. She inherited a kingdom that was bankrupt, religiously divided, and surrounded by enemies. But Elizabeth had learned the art of survival in the Tower. She knew that to rule, she had to be more than a queen. She had to be a master of compromise. Her first act was to return England to Protestantism, developing the Church of England, but she was clever enough to maintain certain Catholic elements, like the crucifix, to appease the traditionalists. She was walking a religious tightrope, and the world was waiting for her to fall. Elizabeth knew she couldn't rule alone, and she quickly assembled a circle of advisors that would become the envy of Europe. At the head of this Privy Council was William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, her trusted Secretary of State. Cecil was the anchor to her ship, the man who understood the mechanics of power as well as she did. But a queen also needs eyes and ears in the shadows. She appointed Sir Francis Walsingham to be in charge of gathering intelligence, essentially creating one of the world's first sophisticated spy networks. Alongside them were Nicholas Bacon and Nicholas Throckmorton, her ambassador to France. These men were experienced and trustworthy, but they all wanted the same thing for their queen or husband. They saw her as a woman who needed a man's guidance, but Elizabeth was already proving that she had the heart and stomach of a king. Presiding over all of this was a figure few Elizabethans would have recognized. Streaked with white and red makeup, resembled nothing so much as Heath Ledger's Joker, or perhaps his copycat grandmother. If you look at her portraits, she was portrayed as regal and wealthy, fashionable, but her actual features look normal and intelligent. Much of the modern distaste for her look has more to do with modern distaste for Elizabethan standards of beauty. Who among us, after all, would dare wear a bumroll than Elizabeth I herself? While her council pushed for a political marriage, Elizabeth's heart appeared to be focused elsewhere. One advisor, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, was notoriously close to the Queen. Rumours swirled through the corridors of the palace that Dudley was more than just a friend. He was a romantic interest, the one man who might actually capture the Virgin Queen's hand. The scandal of their relationship was the gossip of every court in Europe. Dudley was handsome, ambitious, and deeply devoted to Elizabeth, but his presence was a political nightmare. He was already married, and when his wife died, under mysterious circumstances, falling down a flight of stairs, the suspicion of murder clung to him like a shroud. Elizabeth was caught between her personal desire and her public duty. She knew that marrying Dudley could ignite a civil war. And so, once again, the survivor in her won out. She chose the crown over the man. The pressure to marry was relentless. Parliament was insistent that Elizabeth continue the Tudor dynasty with an heir. They presented her with courtships from the most powerful kings and princes in the world, fearing that without a husband, England would be vulnerable to invasion. But Elizabeth's answer was always a variation of the same defiant theme. She declined marriage, famously stating to an insistent Parliament that the welfare of her country was her primary priority. She didn't see herself as a woman in need of a king. She saw herself as a monarch married to her nation. By remaining the Virgin Queen, she kept the powers of Europe at bay, using the promise of her hand as a diplomatic tool without ever actually giving it away. It was the ultimate power play, ensuring that no man, foreign or domestic, could ever claim her throne as his own. Under Elizabeth's steady hand, England didn't just survive, it flourished. Her reign saw a golden age of progress that brought wealth and prestige to a country that had once been on the brink of ruin. Trade expanded rapidly, and the spirit of exploration took hold of the English imagination. In 1580, Francis Drake became the first Englishman to successfully circumnavigate the earth, bringing back riches and glory. 5 years later, Sir Walter Raleigh formed a colony on the east coast of North America, naming it Virginia in honor of his Virgin Queen. This wasn't just about maps. It was about establishing England as a global powerhouse. While the explorers claimed the seas, the arts flourished at home. This was the era of music, poetry, and the birth of modern theatre, led by playwrights like William Shakespeare. The unwanted daughter had turned England into a cultural and economic titan, but even a golden age has its shadows. Elizabeth's biggest challenge would come from her own family tree, her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was everything Elizabeth was, not a Catholic, a woman who had been married multiple times, and a queen who had produced a male heir. To many Catholics, Mary was the rightful Queen of England, making her a constant threat to Elizabeth's throne. Elizabeth kept Mary imprisoned for years, trying to avoid the scandal of killing a fellow sovereign. But Mary became the center of a web of conspiracies. Elizabeth's spy master, Walsingham, used his surveillance network to uncover a plot to overthrow Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. After years of hesitation, Elizabeth was forced to act. In 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was tried for treason and executed. It was a move that secured Elizabeth's throne, but it also invited the wrath of the Catholic world. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, was the final straw for the Catholic King Philip II of Spain. In 1588, he launched a massive invasion force, the Spanish Armada, to remove Elizabeth and restore Catholicism to England. It was the greatest threat England had ever faced. A fleet of ships that seemed invincible. The Virgin Queen, in the end, had defeated the greatest empire on earth, cementing her status as a legendary ruler. As the 17th century dawned, the sun began to set on the Tudor dynasty. Elizabeth had outlived her friends, her rivals, and the men who had once tried to control her. On the 24th of March, Etienne Leobalingsan, at Richmond Palace, Elizabeth, I breathe her last. She was 69 years old, an incredible age for a monarch of her time. Because she had never married or produced an heir, the Tudor dynasty died with her. In a finale, ironic twist of fate, she was succeeded by the Protestant James VI of Scotland, the son of the very cousin she had executed. Mary, Queen of Scots. The depiction of Queen Elizabeth I as grotesque in modern media and later historical portraits is a deliberate intersection of propaganda, toxic beauty standards, and cinematic subversion. While she was the most powerful woman of her era, her visual legacy is defined by a clash between the mask of youth she demanded and the harsh physical reality of her aging. Elizabeth I had begun her life as a scandal and an afterthought, but she ended it as the architect of a New England. She proved that a woman's heart and stomach could indeed rule a kingdom, leaving behind a legacy that still fascinates the world today.